Good evening, everybody. Welcome to our first online North Sydney Conversations event. We hope everyone's coping okay with lockdown, and we're delighted that you've chosen to spend your Thursday evening with us. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet, the Camaragal people, in my case, of the Eora Nation. I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. North Sydney Conversations is run by a group of volunteers and not affiliated with a political party. We want to give people in the North Sydney electorate the opportunity to be part of meaningful discussion with experts about issues that matter, like integrity and climate change. We also want to help connect people with others who are other like-minded locals. Before we get tonight's conversation underway, I also wanted to introduce you to the other volunteers. You'll meet Trine Barter at the end, and our other two volunteers will say a quick hello.
Hi everyone, I'm Liz and I live in Greenwich.
Hi everyone, my name's Johnny and I live in Hunters Hill.
Before we get the conversation underway, I just wanted to let you know that you will have an opportunity to ask questions. Please post your questions in the chat as we go along. For anybody who's not sure where that is, down the bottom of the screen, you'll see a little speech bubble and the word chat. If you click on that, it will open up the chat panel for you. At the conclusion of the conversation, there'll be an opportunity to stay on if you want to participate in what we're calling chat roulette. We're going to allocate people randomly into breakout rooms of 4, and you'll get to continue the conversation and meet some others. It's my great pleasure to introduce our guest tonight. The wonderful Anthony Whealy, who lives in our electorate, is a former Justice of the Supreme Court of New South Wales Court of Appeal and is Chairman of the Centre for Public Integrity. Fabulous Dan Ilic is an investigative humourist and winner of the 2020 Best Comedy Podcast for his podcast, A Rational Fear. Over to you, Dan and Anthony.
Oh, thank you so much. It is great to be with you all tonight. And I am, for one, really excited to find out which of your rorts that you've been following over the last couple of years is your favourite rort. So please, if you've got a favourite rort, get in the chat. Let's talk about it. I might as well throw to Anthony straight up. Anthony, what's your favourite rort over the last 12 months?
I think the Leppington Triangle is my favourite one.
The Leppington Triangle, that is probably the most profitable rort I've ever seen. Buying a bit of land for 3 million, flipping it for 30. Oh my God. I mean, it's something that Moses Obeid would be really proud of if he'd done that. Anthony, it is absolutely privileged to have you in this conversation with us tonight. And I'm sure everyone here is excited to understand a bit more about how integrity and democracy mix. First of all, integrity in our democracy, do we really need it?
Yeah, I think it's the cornerstone, really, of democracy. I like to think of it really as the lifeblood of democracy. If you don't have integrity, you have failing democracy, and the more the lack of integrity increases, you have a decaying democracy, and ultimately democracy fails. And, you know, we've only just got to look at what's happened in the United States to see how true that is. What's at the heart of all of the difficulties the United States is having, why their democracy is being eroded, is really the lack of integrity shown, particularly by the ex-president and by those who were around him.
We like to kind of think of ourselves as a fairly egalitarian, robust democracy, Anthony, I think in Australia. I think Australians themselves would kind of feel that way about the place they live. But is it as robust as we think it is? Is it as strong as we think it is, or are we at extreme risk of losing it all?
I don't think we've got to that stage, but I do think we're on something of a slippery slope over the last few years, and that's a great shame. You know, most Australians, they live an easygoing life. They know who the government is, and they've generally got a fair bit of faith in the government. But over the last few years, there is no doubt that people are losing trust in the present government. You know, I try to be non-partisan. You know, I'm not really supporting one party over another, but because we've had this government in for quite a long time now, I think that maybe they've been in too long, because they, you know, we don't trust them, and so our easygoing nature gets rather irritable when that happens.
I don't know. I don't know why we don't trust them. They promise car parks, and we've been given car parks, Anthony. This is I don't know what you're talking about. No,
Yes,
it's really interesting you say that. Given what's happened today with Scott Morrison's slip of the tongue, where he is making himself accountable for the vaccine rollout, saying he's sorry for how the vaccine rollout has rolled out, but in the end, overall, this seems to be him constantly, once again, passing the buck and not really being accountable for any of the failures that his government has been part of over the last, 8 years.
Yeah, I agree with you, Dan. I think that, you say we've got car parks. Well, we don't have car parks.
That's true. No, we don't have car parks.
We do have promises and a lot of money handed out for car parks, but unfortunately, the car parks aren't anywhere near a railway station. So that makes it very difficult. But no, quite seriously, you're right that this sort of really dissatisfaction with government grants, which is the misuse of taxpayers' money for political purposes, does make us uncomfortable with the government. And you're also right in saying that the consequent problem is the government does not wish to be accountable for any of these situations. They will not be accountable. And you heard Paul Fletcher the other night talking about this, and he demanded to say that these sites for the car parks were selected on the basis of need. Well, the Auditor General's report made it very clear that that just wasn't true.
It is extraordinary to see also the Auditor General's budget being slashed by 7 million over the last 10 years as well by this government as well, which is pretty extraordinary. It's almost like this government doesn't want to be held accountable.
Well, that'll keep them in line, won't it?
Well, let's quickly talk about...
So just as long as he says how much they're going to put in and what they're...
Yep. Sorry. So what we kind of want to get to the crux of tonight, which is Australia's democracy and accountability. Australia's democracy rating was recently downgraded from open to narrow. What does that mean, and what does that mean for our democracy as a whole?
Well, the index that I follow particularly is Transparency International's Corruption Perception Index. And we stand at number 11 out of 180 on that, which you might think at first blush is pretty good.
11 sounds pretty good to me, Anthony. That doesn't sound too bad. That sounds better than where we are, the OECD's vaccine rollout.
That's true. But I mean, even though we stand at 11, we were somewhere like number 19. Much higher than that back in 2012. And we've been sliding down the greasy pole ever since then. And we're now stuck at number 11 and we don't seem to be getting any better. So, yes, of course, there are a lot of countries in the world that are really corrupt, and there are a lot of countries that are much more corrupt than Australia. But nevertheless, we ought to be doing better than that. We ought to be a leader in this, and we're not. And the reason for that, quite simply, is that the perception of Australia is that we don't care too much about controlling corruption. We don't care too much about controlling money laundering. Crown Casino, governments turning a blind eye to enormous money laundering. Millions of dollars a year are being laundered. And that's just one problem. So the perception is we're not doing as well as we should.
It's interesting you say that we don't care too much about that, but I feel like people who live in New South Wales, we are blessed with ICAC, and we do care a little bit about what happens at ICAC and what ICAC finds. You're a big advocate, of course, for a national version of ICAC. Do you think that could potentially change the way rorts are perceived on a Commonwealth level?
Oh, definitely. I've had a bit of experience because I was just for a brief time an assistant commissioner in ICAC. I only ever did one case. It was the Eddie O'Bede case. And
congratulations, by the way.
No, I did the other one about circular key cafes.
Oh, I take that all back. Yeah, that was the fun one. That was the standover one. That was the one that was.
But I'm the person who's never been sued by Eddie, who was an ICAC commissioner. So I feel I've failed really. Didn't do my job properly. But now coming to the federal body, of course we need it. And the fact that we haven't got one is a very important reason why we're failing on the Corruption Perception Index. Why has Australia not got a federal body. There's one in every other state. You know, Dan, I remember, you know, arguing this out years ago in a Senate meeting. George Brandis's representatives were there, and I was arguing that we should have a body like this. And George's representative said, we don't need a corruption body because there isn't any corruption in Australia. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. I'd tell the National COVID Commission that. That'll be really interesting. Hey, Adam Buck on the chat has asked, is there not a difference between corruption for personal gain and corruption for influence and power? To me, the latter has greater impact. That's interesting, given what you and Dave Sharma you and Dave Sharma had an interesting altercation earlier this year. Where do you think many of the people that are in the coalition see the line drawn when it comes to pork barrelling, rorts, and corruption?
Well, you know, actually, I had quite a nice meeting with Dave. He's a very pleasant fellow, but I was a little startled. We talked about what should the definition of corruption be if we're going to have a body that is going to try and weed out corruption. And he accepted, as everybody does, that anyone who commits a criminal offence that answers the description of corruption should be investigated. But when we passed away from criminal offences to what I would call soft corruption, there we parted company. And his view was that, you know, for things like, although he didn't give this illustration, to be fair to him, but I imagine he would say sports rorts, car park rorts, you know, this sort of thing. He'd say, well, they're just government decisions and they shouldn't be investigated by a third party. If the community doesn't like those decisions, they can vote us out at election time. And that's the only way in which those decisions should be scrutinised. And I noticed that only a couple of days ago, Trent Zimmerman really said the same thing when they were chucking out Zali Steggall's bills for a better climate change structure. One of the things that she'd advocated in her bill was that there be a climate commission. No, he said, we don't want a third party to be scrutinising government policy.
We don't need accountability.
No, you can chuck us out at election time. And of course, election time, Dan, as everybody would know who's listening tonight, is the time of great deception, great lies, great misrepresentations. What a perfect time to judge whether or not government decisions are wise.
Yeah, and I can see these local members also putting those ideas to the public as well, saying, oh, well, we did promise you a car park. Oh, well, we did. If you don't like our climate change policy, you can vote us out.
Yeah, well, it's not good enough. I mean, you do have to have, particularly in the area of corruption, you have to have scrutiny. I mean, corruption is really difficult to uncover, Dan. It's not like a crime. You know, somebody throws a brick through your window, that's a crime. And it's pretty easy to see it's occurred. But corruption is deep-seated. It's very hard to dig out. That's why you need a specialist body with specialist powers to get to the, you know, underneath that surface and find out what is really happening.
When you say that it's difficult, what's a good example of corruption that you've seen uncovered in your career that at first glance didn't quite look like it?
Well, I think the recent Eddie Obeid Mount Penny mining situation is a good example of it. What happened there was that the Independent Commission Against Corruption, which was then run by David Ip, now sadly deceased, David received an anonymous tip-off that politicians had some interest in some properties up there and that there might be something slightly scurrilous about it. So that started the investigation. But it then went on for, a year and a half, 2 years before they really got to the bottom of it and were able to hold public hearings and so on. So it was very hard to get underneath the surface.
And also that we go, this is another topic for another time, but also the protection for whistleblowers is now we should bring into question as well. Let's talk about what role does the media play when it comes to integrity in our government? Well,
I think it plays a very significant role. Democracy is, I think, at threat of being disturbed substantially around the world by the impact of media. And even here in Australia, I mean, we've seen what happened in the United States, what's still happening. But here in Australia, the media is bifurcated totally, so that as if you're in two different worlds. You're reading, watching the ABC at night, or reading the Morning Herald or other papers, and then you go on Sky News After Dark, and it's a different world. It's a good name for it, I think. Actually, it's very dark. It's Sky News After Dark.
Sky News in the dark, yeah.
So, and you don't get any interaction between the two, really. There's no scope for the people who follow Sky News After Dark to actually have a legitimate and sensible discussion with people who don't agree with those views. Agrees of, denial of climate change, vaccinations, a hoax, all this sort of thing,
I've lived and worked in the United States. I worked for Al Jazeera and Fusion and Univision in America. And what was quite interesting to me while I was there is that the media landscape is so atomized that there is something for everyone, and so many people are living in their own bubbles. And we're kind of seeing that with social media at the moment. Do you feel like social media is a problem for democracy as well?
I think it is, and it's been proved to be so in other countries. Maybe less so in Australia at the moment, but it's gaining force. I don't like to talk about people I know who are close to me who have the strongest views about how inappropriate it is for anyone to have a vaccination, and a lot of that comes out of social media, and it's not controlled, of course. They believe it's the truth, and how do you have a sensible debate with anyone who has that point of view? Social media's got a lot to blame.
Curry Chew says, I'm still agog that politicians' defence of pork barreling is that it's not illegal. It may not be, but it doesn't make it ethical or appropriate. I think that is absolutely bang on. I'm sure, Carolee, you echo a lot of the sentiments of many of the electorate. That was pretty astounding from Gladys when she came out to say that not a few months ago when she was talking about pork barreling. What was the vibe like inside your community of people who are really focused on integrity in government when she came out very blatantly and said it's not illegal?
Well, I mean, it all depends by what you mean by pork barreling. I mean, in a sense, she ignited a sensible debate by saying that, because the mere fact of offering good things to people elect. The mere fact of offering good things at election time is pork barreling, but it's not necessarily illegal. But it can quickly become unethical. But look, I'd just like to make one focus here. When we're talking about something like the sports rorts scandal, I think we can safely agree upon analysis, maybe we could discuss this another time, that what we saw there was that it was illegal. It was illegal in a number of respects. It wasn't only unethical. And if we had an anti-corruption body with teeth, an effective anti-corruption body, I think that would be exposed and made public, and there'd be no one which the politicians could argue against it.
I mean, I haven't used the spreadsheet and highlighters in a long time, Anthony. But could you tell me, like, how can you get accountability for sports rorts? Is there any accountability? Is there any way to kind of hold the government account to sports rorts?
Not at the moment, without an effective anti-corruption agency. If we had such an agency, then we would be able to hold them to account. I mean, the Auditor General does a great job, but he's not looking for corruption. That's not his task, and nor is it his expertise. It is
a weird thing, like when you read stories about the Auditor General, and the Auditor General is calling out all of this, I'm going to swear, everyone, is calling out all of this bullshit all the time. And it's like the media don't really pick up on it or go too hard on it, and then because the next thing comes along and distracts everyone from what was just said, it's almost like there are no ramifications. I don't know what I'm saying here, but I just think that's just so disheartening as a member of the electorate, that there is no ramifications for the Auditor General's accountability. These people are, the only ramification is being voted out at the election.
Well, there's so much of it around, you see. This is the problem, that people become blasé and they say, oh, well, I mean, it's not a good thing, but what can we do about it? And after all, hear this argument, After all, it kept Bill Shorten out, so it was a great thing, really, wasn't it? You know.
Yeah, right.
In other words,
okay, Michelle's got a question about political donations, and that's where we're going to go next. How do political donations discredit a fair democracy, Anthony?
Enormously. I think the undue influence of money in politics is one of the great scourges of our time in Australia. You know, this is tantamount to bribery on a grand scale. And secondly, you know, just from a constitutional point of view, it means that the citizenry of Australia do not have an equal opportunity to participate in the democratic process. And that, I mean by those high-sounding words that, Dan, you and I don't get an audience with the Prime Minister. You and I don't get much say in what the government decides or does. But the big political donors, the resources sector, mining, coal, gas, they have a big say in what happens because they donate millions to both parties, really, but certainly particularly to the coalition parties. So I think that's a really bad thing, and it can be so easily fixed. But of course, the government doesn't have any appetite for fixing it. All you've got to do is pass some laws that put a cap on donations, that make sure that you know, things like corporate sponsorships and fundraisers where people pay $20,000 to sit next to the Prime Minister, these should be within the classification of a donation, but they're not. And of course, there's no real-time reporting, and there's an absolute, at federal level, there is the complete lack of control of electoral expenditure. Now, all of that is extremely unhealthy, in my opinion.
Jane Coley on the chat says, would a real-time donation register help? Is it possible? Is it possible to have one of those?
Yeah, easily. I mean, and the states do and have become increasingly better with donations. I mean, even New South Wales, with its tremendously strong and proud record of corruption in the past, now has quite strong donation laws. I mean, for example, they won't let property developers donate anything to government or people with interests in gaming and hotels. And, you know, of course, there's a lot of argument about whether that's a good thing or not. But I think
because you don't need money. You just need a bottle of Grange, Anthony.
Yes, that's true. As long as you expose the fact that you've received it. But then the point I'm really making is that we wouldn't have to do all that. We wouldn't have to ban donations from property developers, which some people find unattractive. If we just lowered the cap, put a cap on it and said, well, you can't donate more than $1,000 at a federal level.
Yeah.
And, you know, that's the sort of thing we've got to do. We've got to actually, you know, get rid of the undue influence of money in politics.
If $1,000 was the cap, I would donate so I could get a face-to-face time with the Prime Minister.
I probably wouldn't, but...
Actually, it just depends on his breath. I'm not too sure. All right. So question here from Kate. Christian Porter has changed all grant processes in Department of Industry, Science and Energy and Resources to come from panels with a support / not supported, whereas grants have always been a recommendation from the independent panels until now. It seems like an attempt to circumvent the Australian National Audit Office. What are your thoughts on that, Anthony?
Oh, well, I think they'll always try to get around these things. But, you know, as I say, with an effective audit office, properly funded, an effective anti-corruption commission, they won't get away with it, Dan.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about the Anti-Corruption Commission. Where are we at with a Commonwealth Anti-Corruption Commission? And I remember seeing some press recently saying, you know, there's been proposals, but they're a toothless tiger as such.
Yeah, well, it all began with, you know, attempts to get the federal government to agree to have a anti-corruption body. They would not agree to that year after year. Then Labor came on board out of the blue, and they said, yes, we would, if elected, we would have an effective anti-corruption body. Mark Dreyfus, in particular, supported this idea, and others in the Labor Party are now wedded to it, and I regard it as a matter of policy that they would do that if elected. The independents, a number of independents have supported the notion, the Greens have supported it. and out of the blue, about 2.5 years ago, Christian Porter announced, and Scott Morrison, that they would now support a federal anti-corruption body. Well, 2.5 years later, nothing's happened. And in the last budget, they had a line there that most people probably didn't notice, where they allocated the amount of money they proposed to provide for staff in 2021, 2022 for a federal anti-corruption body. And you know how much it was? Zero, naught. A donut integrity, as I like to say.
But then Anthony, Scott Morrison can do what he likes to do and says, no, Anthony, we put it in the budget. It's in the budget. It's a line item in the budget. I think you'll find in the budget there's a line item for the, you tell me we haven't allocated for it. We've got it in the budget.
And it's naught.
It's naught. Yes, it's naught.
But
yeah.
At the same time, I mean, to be fair to them, they have introduced a draft exposure bill that's based on a model that they announced about 2 years ago. And it's a really interesting creature. If it were implemented, and they don't seem to have any inclination to introduce a bill into Parliament to implement it, but if they did, and it remained in its current form as a draft exposure bill, it would be a disaster for Australia and its reputation internationally, because it is just, I use the words advisedly, it's a complete sham. Can I just have 1 minute or so just to tell you why?
Oh, look, I think this is why we're here. We are here. All the people online right now are ready to hear about complete shams.
All right, well, this complete sham, I mean, I could spend an hour on it, but I won't. But what I'll tell you is this, that it's divided into two divisions. One division deals with law enforcement people, that's police officers, federally, border force, taxation officials, AUSTRAC officials, and they get the bucket poured on them. They're going to be very carefully scrutinised to see and make sure they're not corrupt. On the other side, the other division deals with politicians, parliamentarians, their staff, and 75% of the public service, and they are fully protected from scrutiny and exposure. For example, the difference is a federal policeman, he can be investigated for corruption of any kind. A politician can only be investigated if the corruption is a criminal offence and if there is a reasonable evidence of a reasonable suspicion that a criminal offence has been committed. So when the
so if you're a cop and you get some free burgers at McDonald's, you could get pulled before this commission.
You're a politician and you're tied up with the Leppington Triangle. You can't be investigated.
Oh my God!
And politicians can't be subjected to public hearings nor public reports. So even if they've acted corruptly, the body that investigates them is not allowed to issue a public report informing the community that that is the finding. And I mean, there are many other things wrong with it. No whistleblowers for politicians.
Yep.
You know, on and on it goes. It's a really terrible model, and it would, you know, be very bad for Australia if it were allowed to remain in that form.
Already there is such a lack of transparency in the Australian system. I feel like, there was a New York Times article a couple of years ago about how Australia is the most secretive liberal Western democracy in the world, and how if any kind of information that comes from within inside a public building or a government building gets outside, the person can be arrested and put in jail. And I knew this, and I did a show at the time, and I actually called up the staff at Aussie's Cafe in Parliament House and asked them to text me the specials, and I put that up on screen and said, "See, I can go to jail for this. I can go to jail from this cafe with inside Parliament House that only parliamentarians can go to." But don't worry, on the specials I redacted the sources, so we couldn't tell what source it was on.
It's worse now, Dan, because you would find that the menu at Aussie's Cafe is now regarded as cabinet in confidence, so you wouldn't be able to see it even. So,
well, I put a poor woman in jail. I could put a poor woman in jail for texting it to me. Anyway,
it could infringe national security. I mean,
that's right. That's right.
You wouldn't get lucky at all.
If ASIO's listening, and it's all on the public record, you can go back to my podcast, Irrational Fear, and listen to it. Now, have you discussed any of this with your local member, Trent Zimmerman? And you know, what's your local member and our local member here for North Sydney Voices? What's his opinion on this in terms of an anti-corruption commission and other backbenchers? How do they feel about this?
I haven't had an opportunity to speak to Trent Zimmerman about it. I mean, he's regarded as a moderate, so I would like to talk to him about it. But I imagine his opinion would be very much like Dave Sharma's, which is to say, sure, we don't want any criminal behaviour to be going on in Parliament House, but on the other hand, we don't want the government decisions and policy decisions to be scrutinised by some independent body that, you know, that they weren't elected after all and we were, so we should be able to do it. I don't want to put words in his mouth, but I'd be very surprised if that is not his attitude. It is the party line, and I imagine that's what he would say if scrutinised.
If you have got a question for Anthony, please go to the chat box and chuck in a question there and I'll read them out to Anthony as they come up. So add your questions there and we'll try and get through quite a few before the hour is up. Anthony, for you, over the last 8 years or so with this current government in place, has there been one event that has kind of stood out to you as the I'm going to swear again because this is what I do, I'm sorry, as the fuck me moment, like, wow, I had no idea that level of rorts could occur in public and there be no ramifications?
I wouldn't say so. I'd say what it's been for me is more an incremental situation where it began with small rorts and they've just got bigger and bigger and they almost become an avalanche now. And I think that the thing that really shocks me is that it's the lack of accountability that follows. I mean, anyone can get it wrong, mistakes are made, but you know, the giant fudge goes on. Politicians don't answer questions; they are evasive, and that's just got worse and worse and worse. And all of that's made me quite unhappy, really, and almost despairing of thinking we're going to get anywhere with all of this.
I don't know if you caught insiders last week, but my partner told me to be quiet because I was yelling at Barnaby Joyce so loud when he was saying, "Oh, net zero 50. Well, show us the plan, and we'll, you know, what does it cost?" I'm like, "You've been in power 8 years. You've been in Parliament 25 years, Barnaby Joyce. You know how much this costs. Stop it. We need to do it now." Oh my God! And I'm sure our neighbours thought that I was not being. I don't know what they thought actually, but yeah. Anyway, I've made quite a ruckus. It just gets so frustrating when you see this constant deferral of any kind of real governance, and that's what it is. It's real governance that is not being done. It's simply power plays to remain in power. For what end? There is no end. It seems like these blokes. It just seems like the only reason to be in government is to be in government, but not actually do any governing.
Yeah. And another thing I'd like to add too, Dan, is we have a ministerial code of conduct at federal level. And it seems to me that it's constantly being breached and no one will bring them to account. And the reason for that, of course, is that the prefect in charge of the ministerial code of conduct, who gives the cane if you breach it, is the Prime Minister himself.
He's the Prime
Minister.
Yet
the whole thrust of this code of conduct is that if you're a politician and a minister and you're making decisions, you must make them in the public interest and not look to any personal, political or partisan gain from those decisions. And yet most decisions we see being made fall into the latter category and not the former.
Murray says the NRL code of conduct is tougher, Anthony. Yeah, thank you, Murray. Damien Sturzaker says, should we take any comfort from recent changes to the corruptions law and the Public Interest Disclosure Act in terms of protection for whistleblowers, or will we see more cases like Collery and McBride? Do we need a model like the US where whistleblowers are paid a bounty and encouraged to be whistleblowers?
We need drastic reform for the whistleblower laws. And, you know, those ideas in America of rewarding whistleblowers are not as silly as they sound. And, you know, to see what happened with Bernard Collaery and Witness K, it just makes you shake your head to see Australia trashing its reputation as it's doing by these trials, and so unfair to the men involved. The only good news that came out of it was that witness K, when he pleaded guilty recently, was spared any jail time. And I mean, that was one good thing that come out of it. I mean, he should be a national hero for what he did. He shouldn't be being prosecuted at all.
Yeah, he's not as good looking as Chappelle Corby. That's the only problem. So it's just not going to work for him. A question.
Well, you wouldn't know what he looks like.
Yeah, you know, you just don't know. You know, he's a faceless man.
We don't know who he is or what he looks like.
John Motorelli asks, talking about cabinet in confidence, has there been any increase in classifying documents as cabinet in confidence to avoid FOI legislation? Yes. So has there been an increase in classifying documents as cabinet in confidence?
Yeah, no doubt about it. I mean, you just hear complaints about this week in, week out with the media trying to get access to documents that you would have thought were perfectly appropriate for release. I mean, just take one, for example. When the Auditor General came out with his criticisms of the sports rorts scandal, Phil Gations was asked to do a report by the Prime Minister. He apparently came to a completely different conclusion from the Auditor General, but his report has never been seen. And it's not been seen because it's regarded as cabinet in confidence. And so this is just an example of what we see all the time. Anything that might throw light on something that is really important to the community or might give us an idea of things that are not being done properly are suddenly pushed under this cabinet confidence cloak. And it's a shit. And the freedom of information laws can't get behind it. I think cabinet in confidence is a great idea, but it's being misused at the moment.
Yeah. Here's a question from Andrea Wilson. Can you tell us the difference between Helen Hayes' bill and the government integrity bill?
Helen Hayes' bill is terrific. The government bill is shocking.
Oh, I thought you were going to use another word then, Anthony. Oh, that would have been news.
I don't swear on media, not like some people.
No, sorry, I apologise. It's
you haven't shocked me. But,
good.
But I mean, seriously, Helen Hayes' bill is very carefully considered. It's very effective, and as I've already explained to you, the government's bill or exposure bill is, by contrast, totally ineffective.
Denise Shrivel says, too many people knowingly walking by, no federal ICAC, a highly concentrated Murdoch-dominated media landscape, a largely apathetic voting public. What can we do? Can anything be done? I think this is an interesting point from Denise. So we mentioned, the average Australian voter before. They largely can know something's happening in the background, but don't really care, don't really pay attention closely like this group of people on this Zoom tonight. And those are the kinds of people that need to understand what is going on and the kinds of rorting that is happening in a meaningful way. Can anything be done to kind of reach those people, do you think?
There's no magic wand that I can think of. One of the great things, though, that happened last year, I think, was the victory of Joe Biden in the elections against Trump. I never thought that would happen. And right at the moment, I don't think that Labor will win the next election. There are many reasons for that, but I may be wrong, and maybe people will become sick of the current landscape and see that trust in government has been eroded to too great an extent, and they may want.
I know, Anthony, there are a lot of people on this Zoom call who are really excited to see change in lots of seats going to strong independents who are backing climate action in a meaningful way, because both the ALP and Liberals are very much in bed with the fossil fuel giants. Do you think that is a possibility? Do you think a strong crossbench of independents could mean that Labor could or Liberals could be in a minority government, and they have to actually?
Look, it would be wonderful to see. But, when you look at Zali and her attempts to get this new legislation through, and of course she's failed in that, and Helen Hayes is trying to push her anti-corruption bill, and so far she's not been successful in that. So it's so hard for independents, but every time you meet an independent and get to know them, you have such admiration for them. They're not caught up in the party system. They're actually pushing policies that are good for Australia. And, my heart goes out to all of those independents who have been so good. And, of course, if there were a lot more, things would be better. but, you know, it's hard to find people who want to stand for Parliament. You know, Dan, why don't you have a go?
I'm in Sharma's seat. I could take him on. Come on, let's go, baby. Let's do it. Let's get it happening. You know, I am in Dave Sharma's seat, and I am going to, you know, show my face around a lot more. I plan on International Men's Day to hand out hammers at Edgecliff Station. Just as he handed out flowers on International Women's Day. Yes, it is important for all of us to use the power that we have, I think. All right, let's have another quick look here. Oh, John Motorelli asks, does Helen's bill have the support of the ALP at least?
That remains to be seen, because it hasn't come before the House, but, you know, it's been shuffled off for, you know, inquiry and report. But I think my guess would be they would support it. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, hang on. Someone's tweeted something. Yes. So Anthony, I tweeted back in June that I like Zimmerman, but should I run for North Sydney? I can't run for North Sydney. Thanks for that. I live in Bondi. It would be bad of me to run for North Sydney, but I know, Anthony, someone that does live in North Sydney, who is very knowledgeable and who might have the support. You going to run, Anthony?
No, I'm too old, mate. I'm too old, much too old.
It is interesting. The cut and thrust of lower house politics is a lot more difficult than running for the Senate. I was talking with a well-known television celebrity who may announce his Senate run soon, and he's saying that he would run in Wentworth if he hadn't had some medical problems lately, and if he was actually physically strong enough to withhold the stress that running in a lower house race brings. Because when you do run in the lower house, the incumbents, they don't like giving up power too lightly, and they throw everything at it. So I think for independents to run, you do need to know what's in store for you.
It's the time for younger people, though, I think, Dan. You know, I think younger people, and by that I mean, I sound like ScoMo on the vaccine, don't I? But, anyone under 50.
Yeah. And
run for Parliament.
Anthony Whealy QC has come out to say publicly that anyone who's unvaccinated should run for office. Anthony, thank you so much for joining us on North Sydney Conversations. I might throw it back to for one of the North Sydney folks to wrap this up. I think it's been a super interesting conversation, and it's super important for all of us to be aware of just how integrity is important to our democracy. So thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us tonight. It was a real privilege to chat with you.
Thanks, everybody.
Great. Thank you so much, Dan. Thank you very much, Anthony. We really appreciate you both coming in tonight to talk to us. First, I'd just like to say, you know, part of North Sydney Conversations, our mantra, I suppose, is that we just really want people to have conversations about issues like this that are so important. And we do believe that the more people that you talk to about these issues, then the word does spread and people do become more engaged. And we always do like to leave everybody with resources to take home and take a look at. They'll be on our website, so it'll be difficult to see on the screen here, but we have a link to the Centre for Public Integrity that Anthony chairs, and it is a collaboration of former judges and integrity experts, and they produce some incredible publications, a lot of media information and so forth. And of course, The Rational Fear. We definitely recommend tuning into Dan's podcast. It makes me laugh every week, and believe me, you know, we all need that, especially when you're, for me personally, thinking and talking about climate change. We've put up there a webinar that Anthony did recently with Professor Anne Toomey, and Anne actually provides a 20-minute segment that's a wonderful insight on the rule of law and the illegality involved in the sports rorts scandal, if you'd like to have a real insight into that. And we always like to offer people sort of something that they can take home and do to make people feel empowered, that you can be active in this space. So we've put there a selection of fact sheets from the Centre for Public Integrity to help write letters to Trent Zimmerman and other MPs, Scott Morrison, and there will be a guide to how to write these letters to MPs and also to the press, which is always a great idea to try and get a letter into the editor. And our friends at the Australian Democracy Network kindly provided that information. So if you're interested, please do take a look. Thank you.
Everybody, thank you very much for joining us this evening. For those of you who don't want to stay on for the chat roulette, then now's perhaps the time to say goodbye. We thank you very much for coming. Stay safe, and we hope that you'll be able to come to an event again soon. I'm hoping that we might even be able to do something in person in the not too distant future. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.